Hey guys, tonight we begin with the absolutely bonkers world of historical medicine and how doctors used to treat sadness. Spoiler alert, it involved a lot more skull drilling than you'd expect from your local therapist. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background. And let's ease into tonight's journey together into the wonderfully twisted world of medieval mood management. Let's start with the biggest misconception about historical medicine and mental health. Most people think ancient and medieval doctors were just bumbling idiots with sharp objects, randomly poking holes in people, hoping something good would happen. In reality, they had entire elaborate theoretical frameworks for why drilling holes in your head would cure depression. They just happened to be completely, hilariously wrong. This wasn't some barbaric free-for-all of medical malpractice. It was a carefully organized, institutionally supported system of medical malpractice with academic backing and everything. The medieval period wasn't some dark age where people just accepted sadness as their lot in life and moved on like Stoic philosophers. It was actually a time of intense medical innovation, where brilliant minds were constantly developing new and creative ways to make sick people significantly worse. Medical schools across Europe were churning out doctors armed with the latest theories about bodily humors, spiritual possession, and the therapeutic benefits of controlled brain trauma. If you thought medieval people just shrugged at mental illness and told people to pray harder, think again. They had detailed treatment protocols that would make modern medical ethicists weep into their clipboards. But here's where it gets really interesting, and by interesting, I mean absolutely terrifying. Meet our first star player, a 12th century monk named Brother Hildegard of Bingen. Now, Hildegard wasn't just any monk. She was a polymath, composer, philosopher, and what we might generously call an experimental physician. She believed that sadness was caused by an excess of melancholic humors that needed to be physically drained from the body, like changing the oil in a particularly depressed car. Her solution? A delightful procedure she called cranial decompression therapy, which involved using a device that looked suspiciously like a medieval corkscrew to create therapeutic ventilation in the patient's skull. Hildegard's method involved first determining the exact location of the sadness within the brain through a complex system of astrological charts, urine examination, and what can only be described as medieval mood ring technology. She would then mark the spot on the patient's head with charcoal, say a prayer to Saint Bartholomew, the patron saint of people about to have their heads drilled, and proceed to create what she euphemistically called windows for the soul in the patient's cranium. The fact that many patients reported feeling significantly less sad afterward was attributed to the success of the treatment rather than, the massive head trauma and subsequent loss of consciousness. But Hildegard wasn't working in isolation. She was part of a broader medical community that took the treatment of sadness very seriously indeed. The University of Salerno, Europe's first medical school, had entire courses dedicated to melancholic disorders and their various treatments. Students would spend months learning the precise angles for skull drilling, the optimal size of cranial holes, and the proper aftercare for patients who were lucky enough to survive the procedure. They had textbooks with detailed anatomical drawings showing the pathways of sadness through the human brain, complete with little arrows indicating where the bad humors were supposed to exit through the newly created holes. One particularly enterprising professor, Master Giovanni di Procida, even developed a classification system for different types of sadness-related drilling. There was trepanation melancholicus for general depression, perforatio desperatus for severe cases, and excavatio automatus for patients who had failed to respond to previous treatments. Each procedure had its own specialized tools, ranging from delicate precision drills for minor mood adjustments to industrial-strength boring devices for what they called comprehensive cranial renovation. The most fascinating part is that this wasn't considered experimental or dangerous. It was mainstream medicine. Medieval medical texts describe these procedures with the same casual professionalism that modern doctors use to discuss prescribing antibiotics. They had success rates, contraindications, and even primitive anesthesia techniques involving various combinations of wine, opium, and what they optimistically called therapeutic unconsciousness herbs. The fact that many patients died during these procedures was seen as evidence that their sadness was simply too advanced to treat, rather than any flaw in the drilling methodology. This wasn't just about individual cases of medical enthusiasm either. These treatments reflected deeper beliefs about the nature of mental illness and the human body. Medieval physicians believed that emotions were literally physical substances that could accumulate in the brain like sediment in a wine barrel. Sadness, in particular, was thought to be a thick, dark substance that could clog the brain's natural drainage systems, leading to what they called cerebral congestion. The logical solution was to provide additional drainage routes through strategic skull punctures. The equipment used for these procedures was surprisingly sophisticated for the time period. Medieval medical tool makers developed specialized trepanation kits that included various sizes of drilling bits, cranial saws, bone removal forceps, and what they called humor evacuation tubes, essentially medieval brain straws, designed to help the bad feelings drain out more efficiently. These kits were often beautifully decorated with religious imagery and inspiring Latin phrases like Dominus illuminatio me, the Lord is my light, and Pax et bonum, peace and good, which must have been tremendously comforting to patients about to have holes drilled in their heads. The daily routine at these medieval medical institutions would make modern hospitals look like luxury spas by comparison. Patients arriving for sadness treatment would first undergo what the physicians called comprehensive melancholic assessment, which involved examining their urine color, measuring the circumference of their head at various points, checking the alignment of their teeth, and determining their astrological birth configuration to establish the optimal drilling strategy. This process could take several days, during which patients were fed a special diet designed to soften the cranial humors, essentially bread soaked in wine with various herbs that were supposed to make their skulls easier to drill through. The preparation phase also included what medieval physicians called spiritual optimization, where patients would confess their sins to ensure that demonic influences weren't interfering with the treatment process. There was genuine concern among medical practitioners that attempting to drain melancholic humors from a spiritually contaminated patient could result in evil spirits escaping through the skull holes, potentially possessing nearby medical staff or contaminating the drilling equipment. So patients would spend days in prayer and confession before being deemed ready for cranial intervention. But the most remarkable aspect of medieval sadness treatment was the development of what historians call therapeutic tourism. Wealthy families would send their depressed relatives on elaborate journeys to visit different drilling specialists across Europe, collecting various types of cranial modifications, like some kind of bizarre medical stamp collection. These therapeutic pilgrimages could last for months or even years, with patients traveling from monastery to monastery, university to university, receiving different types of skull work from various regional specialists. One particularly well-documented case involves Lady Beatrice de Montfort, a Norman noblewoman who developed severe melancholia following the death of her husband in battle. Her family commissioned what they called a grand tour of cranial excellence, sending Lady Beatrice on a 2-year journey across Europe to receive the finest drilling treatments available. Her itinerary included trepanation specialists in Paris, humoral drainage experts in Bologna, spiritual drilling practitioners in Bavaria, and what contemporary records describe as experimental cranial artists in Prague. Lady Beatrice's travel journals, which miraculously survived in the archives of a French monastery, provide fascinating insights into the medieval patient experience. She describes the different drilling techniques with the detached curiosity of a modern medical tourist, noting that German practitioners favored robust, efficient perforation methods, while Italian specialists preferred elegant, aesthetically pleasing cranial modifications. The French approach apparently emphasized theoretical sophistication and philosophical drilling, while the Prague practitioners were developing innovative experimental approaches to cranial creativity. What makes Lady Beatrice's case particularly interesting is that she actually seemed to enjoy her therapeutic tour, regardless of whether it improved her depression. The travel, the attention from distinguished medical professionals, the elaborate ceremonies surrounding each drilling procedure, and the social connections she made with other wealthy patients created what we might recognize as the first primitive medical spa experience. She returned home after 2 years with 17 separate skull modifications and what her family described as significantly improved spirits, though modern analysis suggests this improvement was more likely due to the 2 years of travel, social engagement, and meaningful activity rather than the cranial ventilation. The economic impact of the medieval sadness treatment industry was enormous. Entire cities developed their reputations around specific types of cranial expertise, attracting patients and their families from across the known world. Salerno became famous for precision academic drilling, while Paris was known for theologically informed trepanation. German cities like Heidelberg specialized in efficient systematic approaches, while Italian centers like Bologna developed reputations for artistic cranial modification. This medical tourism created entire supporting industries. Innkeepers specialized in accommodating families of drilling patients, offering therapeutic hospitality with rooms designed to optimize recovery from cranial procedures. Blacksmiths developed lucrative sidelines, creating specialized drilling equipment for different types of melancholia treatment. Scribes made fortunes copying and distributing the latest theoretical treatises on optimal skull drilling techniques. Even the church got involved in the sadness treatment industry, with different monastic orders developing their own specialized approaches to religious cranial therapy. The Benedictines favored what they called contemplative drilling, where the trepanation process was combined with extended meditation and prayer. The Franciscans developed humble perforation techniques that emphasized simple, unpretentious skull holes that wouldn't encourage spiritual pride. The Dominicans, being the intellectuals of the church, created elaborate theological frameworks explaining how cranial drilling could serve as a form of physical penance that helped align the patient's suffering with Christ's passion. But perhaps the most creative development in medieval sadness treatment was the emergence of what historians call competitive drilling. Medical practitioners began organizing elaborate public demonstrations where they would showcase their cranial techniques in front of audiences of colleagues, students, and paying spectators. These events were part medical conference, part entertainment spectacle, and part marketing opportunity for drilling specialists looking to attract wealthy patients. The most famous of these competitive drilling events was the annual Festival of Cranial Excellence held in Montpellier, where practitioners from across Europe would gather to demonstrate their latest innovations in skull modification. The festival featured different categories of competition: speed drilling, precision drilling, artistic drilling, and what the organizers called comprehensive therapeutic drilling, where practitioners had to demonstrate their ability to treat multiple types of melancholia through a single, Cranial intervention. These festivals were enormously popular with the general public, who would travel for days to witness the latest advances in sadness treatment technology. Contemporary accounts describe audiences cheering for their favorite drilling specialists and placing bets on which practitioners would achieve the most impressive cranial modifications. The festivals also served as important networking opportunities for medical professionals who would exchange techniques, share theoretical insights, and negotiate collaborative research projects involving various approaches to skull drilling. The level of theoretical sophistication that developed around these practices was truly impressive. Medieval physicians weren't just randomly poking holes in people's heads. They had developed detailed anatomical models showing the precise pathways through which different types of sadness traveled through the brain. They had mathematical formulas. for calculating optimal drilling angles based on the patient's head shape, astrological configuration, and type of melancholic condition. They had elaborate classification systems for different qualities of cranial bone and how these affected drilling strategy. Some particularly ambitious practitioners even developed what they called predictive drilling, techniques for identifying people who might develop sadness in the future and providing preventive cranial modifications before symptoms appeared. This approach was especially popular among wealthy families who wanted to protect their children from potential future melancholia. Young people from noble families would receive prophylactic trepanation as part of their education, along with training in languages, music, and swordsmanship. But Brother Hildegard and Master Giovanni were just the beginning of our journey into the bizarre world of historical sadness treatment. As we'll see, the medical community's approach to mental health only got more creative and more dangerous as time went on. Medieval doctors weren't content to stick with simple skull drilling when there were so many other exciting ways to cure sadness through controlled bodily harm. The transition from medieval to Renaissance medicine would bring innovations that would make cranial drilling look quaint by comparison. We're talking about physicians who looked at skull holes and thought, you know what this needs? More blood, more chemicals, and definitely more opportunities for things to go spectacularly wrong. And if you think cranial ventilation therapy sounds extreme, wait until you hear about the Renaissance innovation of therapeutic blood enthusiasm and the Baroque period's breakthrough discovery of curative intestinal rearrangement. Because, apparently, when your first instinct is to drill holes in sad people's heads, the natural progression is to get even more creative with your approach to human anatomy. The Renaissance brought what historians generously call medical innovation, but what we might more accurately describe increasingly elaborate ways to torture sad people in the name of science. Unlike the relatively straightforward medieval approach of drilling holes and hoping for the best, Renaissance physicians developed comprehensive treatment programs that addressed sadness through what they called total humoral rebalancing, essentially a full-body approach to making depressed people's lives significantly worse. The theoretical foundation for this new approach came from the rediscovery of ancient Greek medical texts, particularly the works of Galen, who had developed detailed theories about the four bodily humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Renaissance doctors took these classical ideas and ran with them like enthusiastic children with scissors, developing elaborate treatment protocols that would make modern torture. Specialists impressed with their creativity and attention to detail. Renaissance medical establishment had become obsessed with what they called scientific precision in treatment methodology. Unlike their medieval predecessors, who were content with relatively simple skull drilling, Renaissance physicians believed that effective melancholia treatment required mathematical calculation, anatomical expertise, and what they proudly called systematic therapeutic intervention. They developed elaborate charts showing the precise relationships between different bodily humors, created detailed timetables for optimal treatment scheduling, and established sophisticated diagnostic procedures that could take weeks to complete. Take the case of Dr. Hieronymus Fabricius, a 16th century physician working in Padua, who became legendary for his innovative approach to treating what he called melancholic congestion. Dr. Fabricius believed that sadness was caused by an accumulation of black bile in the patient's system, which needed to be removed through a combination of bloodletting, purging, and what he euphemistically termed aggressive intestinal enthusiasm. His standard treatment protocol began with the patient being bled until they achieved what he called optimal pallor, essentially until they were too weak to complain. About the treatment, Dr. Fabricius had developed what he considered a revolutionary diagnostic system for determining exactly how much blood needed to be removed from each patient. He would examine the patient's complexion, measure their pulse at 17 different points on their body, analyze their urine using a complex color-coding system, and perform what he called humoral percussion, essentially tapping on different parts of the patient's body and listening to the sounds to determine the consistency of their internal fluids. The bloodletting phase of Dr. Fabricius's treatment was an elaborate affair that could last for days. He had developed specialized equipment, including precision bleeding devices with adjustable flow rates, collection containers marked with exact measurements, and what he called humoral monitoring instruments that allowed him to track the exact composition of the blood being removed. Patients would be bled in specific sequences designed to optimize the drainage of melancholic humors while preserving what Dr. Fabricius called essential vital substances. Once the patient had been appropriately drained of blood, Dr. Fabricius would administer a series of increasingly powerful laxatives designed to evacuate not just the contents of the patient's digestive system, but apparently their will to live as well. His special mixture, which he called melancholic evacuation elixir, contained mercury, antimony, and what contemporary sources describe as herbs of unusual potency. The recipe for this elixir was a closely guarded secret that Dr. Fabricius claimed to have discovered through years of careful experimentation with various toxic substances. The purging phase was conducted with the same systematic precision as the bloodletting. Dr. Fabricius had calculated optimal dosages based on the patient's weight, age, astrological sign, and what he called constitutional humoral capacity. He monitored the effects using detailed charts that tracked the frequency, volume, and consistency of the patient's evacuations, adjusting the dosage according to mathematical formulas that he had developed specifically for melancholia treatment. Patients who survived this initial phase reported feeling significantly different, though whether this represented an improvement in their mood or simply the natural human response to having survived a near-death experience remains unclear. Dr. Fabricius interpreted any change in the patient's condition as evidence of successful humoral rebalancing, regardless of whether the patient actually felt better or had simply been traumatized into a different emotional state. But Dr. Fabricius wasn't content to stop with simple bloodletting and digestive evacuation. He had developed an elaborate theory about the relationship between sadness and what he called corporeal humoral circulation patterns. According to his research, which was published in several prestigious medical journals of the time, depression was caused by black bile becoming trapped in specific areas of the body and creating emotional blockages that prevented the natural flow of happiness-inducing substances. His solution was a procedure he called therapeutic circulation enhancement, which involved making small incisions at strategic points around the patient's body and inserting what he described as humoral drainage tubes, essentially medieval IV lines designed to help the bad humors Section 2. The Renaissance brought what historians generously call medical innovation but what we might more accurately describe as increasingly elaborate ways to torture sad people in the name of science. Unlike the relatively straightforward medieval approach of drilling holes and hoping for the best, Renaissance physicians developed comprehensive treatment programs that addressed sadness through what they called total humoral rebalancing, essentially a full-body approach to making depressed people's lives significantly worse. The theoretical foundation for this new approach came from the rediscovery of ancient Greek medical texts, particularly the works of Galen, who had developed detailed theories about the four bodily humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Renaissance doctors took these classical ideas and ran with them like enthusiastic children with scissors, developing elaborate treatment protocols that would make modern torture specialists impressed with their creativity and attention to detail. Take the case of Dr. Hieronymus Fabricius, a 16th century physician working in Padua, who became legendary for his innovative approach to treating what he called melancholic congestion. Dr. Fabricius believed that sadness was caused by an accumulation of black bile in the patient's system, which needed to be removed through a combination of bloodletting, purging, and what he euphemistically termed aggressive intestinal enthusiasm. His standard treatment protocol began with the patient being bled until they achieved what he called optimal pallor, essentially until they were too weak to complain about the treatment. Once the patient had been appropriately drained of blood, Dr. Fabricius would administer a series of increasingly powerful laxatives designed to evacuate not just the contents of the patient's digestive system, but apparently their will to live as well. His special mixture, which he called melancholic evacuation elixir, contained mercury, antimony, and what contemporary sources describe as herbs of unusual potency. Patients who survived this initial phase reported feeling significantly different, though whether this represented an improvement in their mood or simply the natural human response to having survived a near-death experience remains unclear. But Dr. Fabricius wasn't content to stop with simple bloodletting and digestive evacuation. He had developed an elaborate theory about the relationship between sadness and what he called corporeal humoral circulation patterns. According to his research, which was published in several prestigious medical journals of the time, depression was caused by black bile becoming trapped in specific areas of the body and creating emotional blockages that prevented the natural flow of happiness-inducing substances. His solution was a procedure he called therapeutic circulation enhancement, which involved making small incisions at strategic points around the patient's body and inserting what he described as humoral drainage tubes, essentially medieval four lines, designed to help the bad humors flow out while good humors flowed in. These tubes were connected to a complex system of bottles, pumps, and what can only be described as Renaissance-era mood management machinery. The most ambitious case in Dr. Fabricius's records involved a wealthy merchant named Lorenzo de Maretti, who had come to him suffering from what contemporary sources describe as profound melancholic distress following a series of business failures. Dr. Fabricius decided that Lorenzo's case required what he called comprehensive humoral renovation, essentially a complete overhaul of his patient's entire emotional and physical system. The treatment began with Lorenzo being connected to Dr. Fabricius's drainage apparatus for 3 days, during which various fluids were removed from his body, while a special mixture of wine, herbs, and what the doctor described as liquid optimism was introduced through the tubes. Lorenzo was then subjected to a series of therapeutic temperature variations involving alternating hot and cold baths designed to stimulate his humoral circulation. The final phase involved what Dr. Fabricius called cranial pressure optimization, essentially a more sophisticated version of medieval skull drilling, but with better marketing. According to Dr. Fabricius's notes, Lorenzo emerged from this treatment transformed in both spirit and constitution. Other sources suggest that Lorenzo was so traumatized by the experience that he became convinced he was living in a constant state of divine punishment and spent the rest of his life as a hermit, which his family apparently considered a significant improvement over his previous depressed state. But it wasn't that simple, because Renaissance medicine was never content with simple solutions when complex. Dangerous alternatives were available. Dr. Fabricius's methods were actually considered relatively conservative compared to some of his contemporaries. Dr. Paracelsus, working in Switzerland around the same time, had developed a treatment protocol that involved exposing patients to carefully controlled amounts of various toxic substances, including mercury, lead, and what he called therapeutic poisons. Paracelsus believed that sadness was essentially a form of spiritual contamination that could only be cured by introducing controlled amounts of physical contamination to create what he termed therapeutic toxicological balance. His patients were given graduated doses of increasingly dangerous substances while being monitored for signs of what he called humoral improvement, essentially waiting to see if they died from the treatment or emerged with a renewed appreciation for life. The complications with these treatments were numerous and varied. Patients frequently died from blood loss, poisoning, infection, or what medical records euphemistically describe as treatment-related complications. Those who survived often reported feeling significantly different, though modern analysis suggests this was more likely due to post-traumatic stress disorder than any actual improvement in their depression. The most problematic aspect of these treatments was that they actually seemed to work in some cases, or at least patients and their families reported improvement. This created a feedback loop where doctors became increasingly confident in their methods and began developing even more elaborate and dangerous treatment protocols. Success stories were widely publicized, while treatment failures were attributed to the patient's spiritual inadequacy or the advanced nature of their melancholic condition. The result was a Renaissance medical community that was absolutely convinced it had cracked the code on treating sadness through controlled bodily harm. Medical schools across Europe began offering specialized courses in melancholic therapeutics, and young doctors competed to develop new and innovative approaches to humoral rebalancing. The University of Bologna established the first chair of advanced sadness studies, while the medical faculty at Paris developed a comprehensive curriculum covering everything from basic bloodletting to advanced cranial modification techniques. Meanwhile, patients and their families were caught in an impossible situation. The medical establishment offered sophisticated, scientifically backed treatments for depression, but these treatments were often more dangerous than the original condition. Many families found themselves choosing between watching their loved ones suffer from sadness or watching them suffer from the cure for sadness, which often proved to be significantly worse than the original problem. This created a thriving market for alternative treatments and what we might call medical tourism, as desperate families sought out doctors who claimed to have developed gentler, more effective approaches to treating melancholic disorders. Some physicians began advertising humane humoral rebalancing or gentle sadness evacuation, which usually meant they killed fewer patients than their competitors rather than representing any fundamental improvement in treatment methodology. If Renaissance humoral rebalancing was an elaborate medical symphony of suffering, then the Baroque period's approach to treating sadness was a full orchestral cacophony of therapeutic chaos. Baroque physicians had looked at their Renaissance predecessors, drilling holes and draining fluids, and thought, "You know what this needs? More complexity, more drama, and definitely more opportunities for things to go spectacularly wrong." The Baroque medical community had developed what they proudly called environmental therapeutics, the revolutionary idea that sadness could be cured not just by modifying the patient's body, but by completely redesigning their entire physical and Social environment. This led to the construction of elaborate therapeutic facilities that looked less like hospitals and more like elaborate stage sets designed by someone who had read medical textbooks while having fever dreams. The theoretical foundation for environmental therapeutics was based on the emerging Baroque understanding of what physicians called atmospheric psychology, the idea that human emotions were constantly being influenced by invisible forces emanating from colors, shapes, sounds, smells, and spatial relationships. Baroque doctors believed that depression was often caused by patients living in emotionally incompatible environments that created what they called humoral dissonance between the person and their surroundings. Dr. Balthasar Neumann, working in Bavaria, had become one of the leading advocates for what he called architectural medicine. Dr. Neumann believed that the fundamental problem with previous approaches to sadness treatment was that they focused on changing the patient rather than changing the patient's environment. His revolutionary insight was that human emotions operated according to the same mathematical principles that govern music and architecture, and that depression could be cured by designing living spaces that naturally induced positive emotional states. Dr. Neumann's approach involved conducting detailed environmental assessments of his patients' living situations, measuring everything from ceiling heights and window placement to color combinations and furniture arrangements. He had developed elaborate mathematical formulas for calculating the emotional resonance frequency of different architectural elements, and his treatment plans often involved completely redesigning his patients' homes according to principles of therapeutic geometry. The most ambitious example of Dr. Neumann's architectural medicine was the residence he designed for Baron Franz von Melancholy, a Bavarian nobleman who had developed severe depression following a series of military defeats. Dr. Neumann convinced the Baron to demolish his existing castle and rebuild it according to therapeutic architectural principles, creating what he called a comprehensive residential treatment facility designed for optimal emotional functionality. The new castle featured rooms with precisely calculated proportions designed to encourage specific emotional states. The Chamber of Morning Optimism had walls painted in graduated shades of yellow that were supposed to stimulate happiness-inducing humoral responses, while the Hall of Afternoon Contemplation featured blue and green color schemes calculated to promote calm reflection. The dining room of nutritional enthusiasm was designed with specific lighting and spatial relationships that Dr. Neumann believed would enhance the emotional benefits of properly prepared meals. But Dr. Neumann's architectural innovations went far beyond simple interior decoration. He had developed theories about the psychological effects of different geometric shapes and incorporated these into every aspect of the castle's design. Doorways were constructed as perfect arcs calculated to create transitional emotional experiences as people moved between rooms. Staircases were built with specific proportions designed to encourage uplifting psychological momentum as people climbed to higher floors. The most elaborate feature of Baron von Melancholy's therapeutic castle was what Dr. Neumann called the Emotional Optimization Observatory, a tower designed to provide the Baron with daily exposure to what the doctor believed were the most therapeutically beneficial views. The observatory featured precisely positioned windows that offered carefully framed views of landscapes, architectural elements, and natural phenomena that Dr. Neumann had determined would promote positive emotional responses. Consider the extraordinary case of the Melancholia Palace, constructed in 1687 by Dr. Giuseppe Arcimboldo in the hills outside Naples. Dr. Arcimboldo had become convinced that traditional treatments failed because they didn't address what he called the architectural psychology of sadness. His theory was that depression was fundamentally a problem of spatial and temporal disharmony. Essentially, sad people were living in the wrong shapes of rooms at the wrong times of day. The Melancholia Palace was designed as a comprehensive residential treatment facility where every aspect of the building was carefully calculated to induce specific emotional states. The entrance hall was constructed with golden proportions and painted in what Dr. Arcimboldo called optimism yellow, a color he had developed through extensive research into the emotional properties of various pigments. The yellow paint contained ground sunflower petals, crushed topaz, and what Dr. Arcimboldo described as essence of cheerfulness, a substance that modern analysis suggests was primarily gold leaf, mixed with various aromatic oils. Dr. Arcimboldo had spent years researching the emotional effects of different colors, conducting experiments where he would expose volunteers to various pigments while monitoring their humoral responses. His research notes describe elaborate procedures for testing color combinations, measuring subjects' pulse rates, breathing patterns, and what he called facial expression optimization indicators when exposed to different visual stimuli. Patients would progress through a series of increasingly elaborate rooms, each designed to address a different aspect of their melancholic condition. The chamber of humoral circulation featured walls that curved in mathematical spirals designed to encourage the proper flow of bodily fluids, while the room of therapeutic resonance contained precisely tuned bells and chimes that were supposed to vibrate at frequencies that would literally shake the sadness out of patients' bodies. The room of therapeutic resonance was perhaps Dr. Arcimboldo's most ambitious creation. The chamber was designed as a perfect acoustic space where every surface was calculated to produce specific sound effects. The walls were covered with resonating panels made from different types of wood that had been aged in wine barrels for precisely 7 years. The ceiling featured a complex arrangement of metal tubes and chambers that created what Dr. Arcimboldo called harmonic amplification effects. When air passed through them, patients in the room of therapeutic resonance would be positioned at the exact acoustic center of the chamber while trained musicians performed compositions that Dr. Arcimboldo had written specifically for melancholia treatment. These pieces incorporated specific musical intervals that he believed had direct effects on humoral circulation, with different compositions prescribed for different types of sadness. His fugue for mild melancholia featured gentle harmonies designed to encourage gradual emotional improvement, while his symphony for severe depression included dramatic crescendos and carefully calculated dissonances intended to shock patients out of their melancholic states. The crown jewel of the facility was the Hall of Emotional Metamorphosis, a vast domed space filled with mirrors, prisms, and what Dr. Arcimboldo described as optical instruments of psychological transformation. The hall was designed to create constantly changing patterns of light and color that would stimulate what he called visual humoral responses in patients experiencing different types of emotional distress. The Hall of Emotional Metamorphosis featured a complex system of mirrors and lenses that could be adjusted to create different optical effects throughout the day. Patients would spend hours in the hall while attendants manipulated the optical instruments to produce specific visual experiences designed to address their individual therapeutic needs. Dr. Arcimboldo had developed detailed charts showing the correspondence between different light patterns and various emotional states, and his treatment protocols specified exact sequences of visual stimuli for different types of melancholic conditions. Patients at the Melancholia Palace followed a strict daily routine that began at dawn with tonal awakening therapy, essentially being woken up by musicians playing specific musical intervals that were supposed to align their humoral rhythms with cosmic harmony. The musicians were specially trained in what Dr. Arcimboldo called therapeutic performance techniques, which involved not just playing the correct notes, but also maintaining specific facial expressions and body postures that were supposed to enhance the emotional effects of the music. After Breakfast, served on plates painted with images of smiling cherubs and decorated with geometric patterns designed to promote digestive optimism. Patients would participate in architectural perambulation therapy, which involved walking through the building's corridors in carefully prescribed patterns, designed to encourage positive spatial relationships with their environment. The corridors were marked with subtle indicators showing the optimal walking pace and breathing rhythm for different sections of the building. The afternoon activities included chromatic immersion sessions, where patients would sit in rooms bathed in different colored lights while trained attendants monitored their humoral responses, and geometric contemplation therapy, where they would meditate on various mathematical shapes that Dr. Arcimboldo believed had inherent anti-melancholic properties. The geometric contemplation sessions involved patients staring at carefully designed visual displays featuring circles, triangles, and complex mathematical figures that were supposed to induce specific psychological states through what Dr. Arcimboldo called mathematical emotional resonance. Evenings concluded with harmonic realignment sessions, featuring live performances of music, specifically composed to correct what the doctor called discordant emotional frequencies. These concerts were held in specially designed performance spaces where every acoustic element had been calculated to produce optimal therapeutic effects. The musicians wore costumes designed according to color theory principles, and the audiences were seated in arrangements based on geometric patterns that Dr. Arcimboldo believed would enhance the emotional impact of the performances. But Dr. Arcimboldo's architectural approach was just one example of the Baroque period's commitment to making sadness treatment as complicated as humanly possible. Dr. Johann Kunzmann, working in Vienna around the same time, had developed what he called zoological psychotherapy, the innovative idea that depression could be cured through carefully managed interactions with specific animals that possessed natural anti-melancholic properties. Dr. Kunzmann's clinic featured an elaborate menagerie of creatures that he had classified according to their therapeutic potential. Peacocks were used to treat patients suffering from aesthetic melancholia, while specially trained monkeys were employed for cases involving social humoral dysfunction. His star performer was a bear named Giuseppe, who had been trained to perform what Dr. Kunzmann called therapeutic embrace therapy, essentially bear hugs that were supposed to physically squeeze the sadness out of patients. The most ambitious treatment in Dr. Kunzmann's repertoire involved what he called comprehensive zoological immersion therapy. Patients would spend weeks living in carefully constructed habitats alongside animals that had been selected for their specific antidepressive qualities. One wealthy Viennese merchant reportedly spent 3 months living in a custom-built tree house with a family of squirrels that Dr. Kunzmann believed possessed especially potent cheerfulness-inducing properties. These weren't isolated experiments in therapeutic creativity. The Baroque medical community had developed an entire theoretical framework around what they called environmental humoral dynamics, the idea that emotions were constantly being influenced by every aspect of a person's physical and social environment. This led to incredibly detailed treatment protocols that specified not just what patients should eat and drink, but what colors they should see, what sounds they should hear, what textures they should touch, and even what smells they should smell. Throughout their recovery process, Dr. Cornelius van Houten, working in Amsterdam, had established what he called the Sensory Optimization Institute, where patients underwent comprehensive evaluations to determine their individual therapeutic sensory profiles. Some patients were prescribed diets consisting entirely of foods that were specific colors, while others were required to sleep in beds made from particular types of wood that were supposed to emit beneficial humoral influences during the night. The most extreme case in Dr. Van Houten's files involved a Dutch banker who had developed what contemporary sources describe as catastrophic melancholic syndrome Following a series of business disasters, the doctor's treatment plan required the patient to spend 6 months living in a specially constructed chamber painted entirely in gradations of blue, which Dr. Van Houten believed was the most therapeutically active color, while being exposed to a carefully orchestrated sequence of sounds, smells, and tactile experiences designed to gradually reprogram his humoral responses. The patient's daily routine included waking up to the sound of specifically tuned wind chimes, eating meals that had been prepared according to complex recipes designed to optimize his humoral balance, and spending hours each day manipulating objects with specific textures that were supposed to stimulate positive emotional responses through his fingertips. The treatment concluded with what Dr. Van Houten called comprehensive sensory graduation therapy, where the patient was gradually reintroduced to normal environmental stimuli under carefully controlled conditions. But the complications with these environmental approaches were even more elaborate than the treatments themselves. The Melancholia Palace reportedly had a mortality rate that would make modern hospitals weep, largely due to patients falling down the building's therapeutically curved staircases or being injured by the various optical and mechanical devices installed throughout the facility. Dr. Kuntzmann's zoological therapy resulted in numerous cases of what medical records diplomatically describe animal-related treatment complications, while Dr. Van Houten's sensory optimization frequently led to patients developing what can only be described as acquired synesthesia and other neurological complications. Yet these treatments continued to gain popularity because they offered something that earlier approaches lacked. They looked scientific and sophisticated, while providing elaborate explanations for why they worked. Families could visit these facilities and see impressive displays of mathematical instruments, exotic animals, and architectural marvels that clearly represented serious medical science rather than random experimentation with power tools. The broader pattern that emerged during this period was the medicalization of sadness into an increasingly complex technical problem that required increasingly elaborate technical solutions. Rather than simple sadness being treated with simple remedies, depression had become a sophisticated malfunction of multiple bodily and environmental systems that demanded comprehensive interdisciplinary intervention involving mathematics, architecture, music, zoology, and various forms of applied mysticism. By the early 18th century, the medical community's approach to treating sadness had reached what historians now call peak therapeutic insanity. The various competing schools of thought, the skull drillers, the humoral rebalancers, the environmental architects, and the zoological therapists had all achieved remarkable success in making their patients' lives significantly worse while maintaining absolute confidence in their methods. The stage was set for what would become known as the Great Melancholia Controversy of 1734, a medical scandal that would make modern pharmaceutical controversies look like polite disagreements about tea preferences. The medical establishment had become increasingly competitive, with different schools of thought vying for prestige, wealthy patients, and academic recognition. Medical journals were filled with heated debates about optimal drilling angles, proper humoral drainage techniques, and the therapeutic potential of various exotic animals. Professional conferences had devolved into elaborate displays of one-upmanship, where physicians would demonstrate increasingly dangerous and complex treatments to impress their colleagues and attract new patients. The theoretical foundations underlying these competing approaches had become so elaborate that they required teams of scholars just to understand them. The University of Göttingen had established an entire faculty dedicated to comparative melancholia studies, where professors spent their time developing mathematical models to explain why their particular approach to sadness treatment was superior to all others. Students could now earn advanced degrees in theoretical skull drilling, applied humoral engineering, or environmental therapeutic architecture. The crisis began when Dr. Maximilian von Oberstein, the most prominent melancholia specialist in the Holy Roman Empire, announced that he had developed what he called the definitive cure for sadness. Dr. von Oberstein had spent decades studying the various competing approaches to depression treatment and had become convinced that previous methods failed because they addressed only individual aspects of the problem. His revolutionary solution was to combine all existing treatments into what he called comprehensive melancholic intervention protocol. Essentially, every dangerous medical procedure from the past 500 years applied simultaneously to the same unfortunate patient. Dr. von Oberstein's background made him uniquely qualified to develop such an ambitious treatment protocol. He had trained with the leading skull drilling specialists in Prague, studied humeral rebalancing techniques in Italy, spent time with environmental therapists in France, and even worked with zoological therapy practitioners in Vienna. His credentials were impeccable. He held positions at 3 different universities, had published extensively on melancholic disorders, and had treated several members of minor nobility with what he claimed were remarkable results. The comprehensive melancholic intervention protocol was a masterpiece of medical complexity that would have impressed even the most elaborate Baroque physicians. Dr. von Oberstein's method began with traditional trepanation to release cerebral pressure, but used precision drilling techniques that incorporated Renaissance anatomical knowledge and Baroque mathematical precision. The skull work was followed by aggressive bloodletting and purging using the most advanced humeral rebalancing methods available, with careful measurement and analysis of all fluids removed from the patient's body. Patients would then be subjected to environmental therapy in specially constructed chambers while being exposed to various therapeutic animals and given carefully measured doses of toxic substances to achieve toxicological balance. The entire process was supposed to take 6 months and cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. But Dr. von Oberstein promised that patients who completed the full protocol would emerge completely cured of all forms of melancholic distress. The theoretical framework supporting Dr. von Oberstein's comprehensive approach was incredibly sophisticated, incorporating elements from classical medicine, Renaissance humeral theory, Baroque environmental psychology, and what he called advanced therapeutic mathematics. He had developed detailed charts showing how the different treatment components would work together synergistically, with skull drilling providing optimal drainage for humeral rebalancing, environmental factors supporting the effects of toxic substances, and animal therapy reinforcing the psychological benefits of the other interventions. The announcement of this new treatment method created an immediate sensation in medical circles across Europe. Here was a practitioner who wasn't just advocating for one particular approach to sadness treatment, but was promising to combine the best elements of all existing methods into a single, comprehensive cure. Medical professionals who had been competing with each other for decades suddenly found themselves united in their excitement about Dr. von Oberstein's innovation. But Dr. von Oberstein's grand announcement attracted the attention of Dr. Gottfried Leibniz Jr., not the famous philosopher, but his considerably less successful nephew, who had been developing his own competing approach to sadness treatment. Dr. Leibniz believed that previous methods failed because they were based on fundamentally flawed assumptions about the nature of depression. According to his research, sadness wasn't caused by humoral imbalances, environmental factors, or spiritual contamination. It was actually a form of temporal dysregulation that required what he called chronological therapeutic intervention. Dr. Leibniz's theory was that depressed patients were essentially living at the wrong speed relative to the universe around them. His treatment involved exposing patients to carefully timed sequences of stimuli designed to resynchronize their temporal rhythms with cosmic harmony. Patients would be required to follow extremely precise schedules involving eating, sleeping, and performing various activities at specific times calculated, according to astronomical observations and complex mathematical formulas. The chronological therapeutic intervention approach was based on Dr. Leibniz's extensive research into what he called temporal medicine, the idea that human health was fundamentally connected to cosmic rhythms and that illness resulted from disruptions in the patient's synchronization with universal time patterns. He had spent years developing instruments for measuring what he called chronological alignment indicators and had created elaborate charts showing the optimal timing for different types of therapeutic interventions. Dr. Leibniz's diagnostic process involved determining each patient's individual temporal profile through a series of tests that measured their natural biological rhythms and compared them to astronomical calculations. Patients would be monitored for weeks to establish their baseline temporal patterns, after which Dr. Leibniz would develop personalized schedules designed to gradually realign their internal clocks with cosmic harmony. The conflict between Dr. von Oberstein's comprehensive approach and Dr. Leibniz's temporal therapy escalated when both doctors agreed to a public demonstration of their methods. The event was scheduled for October 15, 1734, at the prestigious Medical Academy of Göttingen, and attracted physicians, philosophers, and curious nobles from across Europe. Each doctor would treat a patient suffering from severe melancholia, using their respective methods, with the results to be evaluated by a panel of distinguished medical experts. The Medical Academy of Göttingen had been chosen as the venue because of its reputation for scientific objectivity and its state-of-the-art facilities for medical demonstrations. The Academy had recently constructed a new amphitheater specifically designed for public medical procedures, complete with optimal lighting, acoustic properties for clear communication between practitioners and observers, and specialized equipment for monitoring patient responses during treatment. The selection process for the demonstration patients was extensive and controversial. Both Dr. von Oberstein and Dr. Leibniz insisted on having input into which patients would be used to demonstrate their methods, leading to weeks of negotiations about the appropriate criteria for patient selection. The final compromise involved selecting patients with similar types and severity of melancholic symptoms, matched for age, social status, and previous treatment history. The patients selected for this demonstration were Count Wilhelm von Schweikart, a German nobleman who had been suffering from depression following a series of military defeats, and Baron Friedrich von Schwermet, an Austrian aristocrat whose melancholia had reportedly been triggered by an unsuccessful love affair. Both men had volunteered for the experiment in desperation after conventional treatments had failed to improve their conditions. Count Wilhelm's depression had begun after a series of military campaigns that had resulted in significant losses for his regiment. Contemporary accounts describe him as having been a confident and optimistic leader before these defeats, but the experience of losing so many men under his command had left him in a state of profound melancholic distress. Previous treatments had included traditional bloodletting, various herbal remedies, and what medical records describe as spiritual counseling, but none had produced any improvement in his condition. Baron Friedrich's melancholia had developed following his rejection by a young woman he had hoped to marry. The Baron had apparently been deeply in love and had expected the proposal to be accepted, but the woman's family had refused the match for political reasons. The emotional devastation of this rejection had left the Baron unable to eat, sleep, or engage in his normal social activities. He had tried various treatments including travel, changes of scenery, and what contemporary sources describe as diversional activities, but his depression had only worsened over time. Dr. von Oberstein began his comprehensive treatment of Count Wilhelm with great ceremony, providing detailed commentary about the theoretical foundations of his approach for the assembled medical audience. The initial trepanation was performed using the most advanced drilling techniques available, with Dr. von Oberstein explaining the precise anatomical reasoning behind each aspect of the procedure. The audience was genuinely impressed by the systematic nature of the intervention and the sophisticated equipment being used. The skull drilling phase took several hours, during which Dr. von Oberstein carefully created multiple precisely positioned holes designed to optimize cranial drainage while minimizing damage to essential brain structures. He used specialized instruments that allowed for exact depth control and had developed techniques for monitoring the patient's responses throughout the procedure to ensure optimal results. The count was then subjected to bloodletting using a sophisticated apparatus that Dr. von Oberstein had designed specifically for optimal humeral drainage. The device featured precision measurement systems that allowed for exact control of blood removal rates and sophisticated filtering mechanisms that enabled analysis of the humeral content of the blood being extracted. Contemporary accounts describe the audience as being impressed by the systematic nature of the intervention and fascinated by the precision of the humeral extraction process. Meanwhile, Dr. Leibniz was implementing his temporal therapy with Baron Friedrich. The Baron was placed in a specially constructed chamber where every aspect of his environment was precisely timed according to Dr. Leibniz's calculations. The chamber featured advanced chronological monitoring equipment, including precision timepieces, astronomical observation instruments, and what Dr. Leibniz called temporal alignment indicators that measured the Baron's synchronization with cosmic rhythms. Baron Friedrich was fed specific foods at exact intervals, calculated according to astronomical observations, exposed to different types of light according to carefully planned schedules that corresponded to celestial movements, and required to perform various physical exercises that were supposedly synchronized with cosmic rhythms. Dr. Leibniz monitored the Baron's progress using instruments that measured what he called temporal alignment indicators, essentially checking whether the Baron's biological rhythms were becoming properly synchronized with universal time patterns. For the first few days, both treatments appeared to be proceeding according to plan. Count Wilhelm survived the initial phases of Dr. von Oberstein's comprehensive protocol and reported feeling different, while Baron Friedrich claimed to be experiencing what Dr. Leibniz described as preliminary chronological adjustment symptoms. The medical audience was taking detailed notes, and early reports suggested that both approaches were showing promise. The atmosphere at the Medical Academy was one of intense excitement and scientific anticipation. Daily reports were being sent to medical institutions across Europe, and the demonstration was being hailed as a potential breakthrough in the scientific understanding of melancholia treatment. Betting pools had even been established among the observers regarding which treatment approach would prove more effective. But on the fourth day of the demonstration, things began to go spectacularly wrong. Count Wilhelm, who had been progressing through the environmental therapy phase of his treatment while still recovering from the bloodletting and trepanation, suddenly developed what contemporary sources describe as comprehensive therapeutic complications. He became convinced that the various colored lights and therapeutic animals were part of an elaborate conspiracy to steal his soul, and began attacking the facility's peacocks while screaming about humeral infiltration agents. Simultaneously, Baron Friedrich was experiencing his own crisis with the temporal therapy. Dr. Leibniz's precisely timed treatment schedule had apparently succeeded in completely disrupting the Baron's natural sleep patterns, digestive rhythms, and what we would now recognize as his circadian cycles. The Baron reported feeling like he was living in multiple time periods simultaneously and began behaving as if he were having conversations with people from different historical eras. The medical audience, which had gathered to witness a scientific demonstration of advanced therapeutic techniques, instead found themselves watching two aristocrats descend into what can only be described as treatment-induced madness. Count Wilhelm had barricaded himself in the chamber of humoral circulation and was refusing to come out until someone could guarantee that his bodily fluids hadn't been replaced with foreign substances. While Baron Friedrich was demanding to know why nobody had told him that Napoleon had been defeated at Waterloo, which wouldn't happen for another 81 years. The immediate response from the medical community was a fascinating display of professional damage control. Dr. von Oberstein insisted that Count Wilhelm's condition represented a therapeutic breakthrough. The treatment had successfully evacuated the melancholic humors, but the patient was now experiencing psychological adjustment challenges as his mind adapted to its new humoral configuration. Dr. Leibniz claimed that Baron Friedrich's temporal displacement symptoms proved that the treatment was working, but perhaps too well. The Baron had achieved such perfect chronological synchronization that he was now experiencing temporal omnipresence. The broader implications of this disaster were enormous. The medical establishment had invested centuries of research and development in perfecting various approaches to treating sadness, and the public demonstration had revealed that their most advanced techniques were not only ineffective, but actively dangerous. Worse yet, the failure wasn't subtle or gradual. It was immediate, dramatic, and impossible to ignore or explain away. Around the main drama of competing melancholia treatments, a fascinating cast of supporting characters was developing their own unique approaches to the sadness problem, each contributing their own special brand of medical creativity to the growing catalog of ways to make depressed people's lives more interesting. Sister Margareta von Heilbronn, a Benedictine nun working in a Bavarian monastery, had developed what she called spiritual hydraulics, the theory that sadness was caused by insufficient circulation of divine grace through the patient's soul, which could be improved through strategic prayer hole drilling. Sister Margareta's background was unusual for a medical practitioner of her era. She had originally entered the convent following a profound religious experience, but her interest in healing had led her to study both traditional monastic medicine and the latest secular approaches to melancholia treatment. Her unique position as both a religious figure and a medical practitioner allowed her to develop therapeutic approaches that combine spiritual and physical interventions in ways that secular physicians couldn't attempt. Sister Margareta believed that traditional trepanation was theologically incomplete because it only addressed the physical aspects of cranial pressure without considering the metaphysical drainage requirements. Her innovation was to combine skull drilling with intensive prayer sessions, creating what she called sacred ventilation therapy. Patients would have holes drilled in their heads while monks chanted specific prayers, designed to encourage the flow of divine grace through the newly created openings. The fact that many patients reported having profound religious experiences during this procedure was considered evidence of its spiritual effectiveness rather than, the natural human response to having their brains exposed to air. The theoretical foundation for Sister Margareta's spiritual hydraulics was based on her interpretation of medieval theological texts combined with contemporary medical knowledge about humoral circulation. She believed that the human soul required constant circulation of divine grace to maintain optimal spiritual health, and that depression was fundamentally a spiritual condition caused by blockages in the soul's natural connection to God. The skull drilling was intended to create physical pathways through which divine grace could flow more freely into the patient's spiritual essence. Sister Margareta's diagnostic process involved both physical examination and spiritual assessment. Patients would undergo traditional medical evaluation to determine their humoral balance and cranial pressure, but they would also participate in extended confession sessions designed to identify spiritual blockages that might be interfering with divine grace circulation. She had developed elaborate charts showing the correspondence between different types of sins and specific patterns of spiritual obstruction that required different drilling approaches. The monastery where Sister Margherita practiced had been converted into what she called a sacred medical sanctuary, featuring specialized chambers for different aspects of spiritual hydraulic therapy. The main treatment room was designed as both a medical facility and a chapel, with surgical equipment arranged around a central altar, where patients would receive the sacraments during their drilling procedures. The walls were decorated with religious imagery specifically chosen to encourage divine grace circulation, and the entire space was consecrated according to elaborate rituals that Sister Margareta had developed for optimal spiritual therapeutic conditions. Meanwhile, Professor Dmitry Volkonsky at the Imperial Academy of Sciences in St. Petersburg had taken a completely different approach, developing what he called meteorological melancholia management. Professor Volkonsky had become convinced that depression was primarily caused by inappropriate weather patterns affecting the patient's humoral balance. His solution was to create artificial weather systems inside specially constructed treatment chambers, where patients would be exposed to carefully controlled sequences of rain, wind, snow, and sunshine to optimize their emotional responses to atmospheric conditions. Professor Volkonsky's interest in meteorological medicine had developed from his observations of seasonal patterns in melancholic disorders. He had noticed that certain types of depression seemed to worsen during specific weather conditions, and had begun to suspect that atmospheric pressure, humidity, and temperature fluctuations had direct effects on humoral circulation. His research involved detailed monitoring of weather patterns and their correlation with patient symptoms, leading him to develop theories about optimal atmospheric conditions for different types of therapeutic intervention. Professor Volkonsky's weather chambers were marvels of 18th century engineering, featuring complex systems of pipes, pumps, and what he called atmospheric recreation devices that could simulate everything from gentle spring breezes to thunderstorms. The chambers were equipped with sophisticated temperature control systems, humidity regulators, air circulation devices, and even apparatus for creating artificial lightning and thunder effects. Each chamber could be programmed to reproduce specific weather patterns from different geographic regions and seasons. Patients would spend weeks living in these artificial environments while Professor Volkonsky monitored their responses to different meteorological conditions. His treatment protocols involved exposing patients to carefully designed sequences of weather patterns, starting with mild, pleasant conditions and gradually introducing more dramatic atmospheric variations designed to stimulate therapeutic responses. His notes describe elaborate treatment protocols involving therapeutic snowfall sessions, curative tornado exposure, and optimized lightning therapy for particularly stubborn cases of melancholia. The most ambitious patient in Professor Volkonsky's files was a Russian merchant named Ivan Gromovich, who had developed severe depression following a series of catastrophic business deals involving fur trading in Siberia. Professor Volkonsky decided that Ivan's case required what he called comprehensive seasonal simulation therapy, essentially exposing him to an entire year's worth of weather patterns condensed into a 6-month treatment program. Ivan spent his days experiencing accelerated seasons while Professor Volkonsky carefully monitored his humoral responses to each weather transition. Ivan's treatment schedule was incredibly complex, involving precise timing of different atmospheric conditions, designed to reproduce the natural psychological effects of seasonal changes. Morning sessions might feature spring-like conditions with gentle warmth and light rain, while afternoons could involve summer thunderstorms with dramatic temperature fluctuations. Evenings were typically devoted to autumn weather patterns with gradually cooling temperatures and changing humidity levels, followed by winter conditions during the night hours. Professor Volkonsky had developed specialized equipment for monitoring Ivan's responses to these artificial weather patterns. He measured the merchant's pulse, temperature, breathing patterns, and what he called atmospheric sensitivity indicators throughout each simulated season. The data was recorded in detailed charts that tracked correlations between specific weather conditions and various aspects of Ivan's emotional state. These weren't isolated incidents of individual medical creativity. The broader medical community had developed an entire network of specialists working on what they called auxiliary melancholic interventions, treatments designed to address specific aspects of depression that the main therapeutic approaches might have overlooked. Dr. Benedetto Marcello had established a practice in Venice specializing in musical humoral therapy, where patients listened to carefully composed pieces designed to vibrate their internal organs at frequencies that would encourage positive emotional states. Dr. Marcello's approach was based on his theory that different musical intervals had specific effects on the body's humoral circulation. He believed that sound waves could directly influence the movement of bodily fluids, and that depression was often caused by humoral stagnation that could be corrected through exposure to properly calibrated musical vibrations. His treatment sessions involved patients lying in specially designed chambers while musicians performed compositions that Dr. Marcello had written specifically for their individual therapeutic needs. The musical therapy chambers were acoustically engineered to amplify specific frequencies while dampening others, creating what Dr. Marcello called therapeutic sonic environments. Patients would be positioned at precise locations within the chambers to optimize their exposure to the most beneficial sound waves, and their responses would be monitored using instruments that measured pulse rate, breathing patterns, and what Dr. Marcello described as humoral resonance indicators. Dr. Marcello had developed different musical prescriptions for various types of sadness: melancholic waltzes for mild depression, therapeutic fugues for moderate cases, and what he called symphonic emotional evacuation pieces for severe melancholia. His compositions incorporated specific mathematical relationships between musical intervals that he believed corresponded to optimal humoral circulation patterns. The most complex pieces required orchestras of specially trained musicians who had been educated in the therapeutic properties of different musical elements. The interconnected nature of these various treatment approaches created a thriving medical tourism industry across Europe. Wealthy patients would travel from city to city, collecting different therapeutic experiences like some kind of bizarre medical scavenger hunt. A typical grand tour of melancholia treatment might begin with trepanation in Germany, followed by humoral rebalancing in Italy, environmental therapy in France, and meteorological treatment in Russia, with various musical, zoological, and spiritual interventions added along the way. Count Alessandro di Tristezza, a Venetian nobleman, reportedly spent 3 years traveling across Europe collecting melancholia treatments. His journey included skull drilling in Prague, bear therapy in Vienna, architectural therapy in Paris, and weather simulation in St. Petersburg, followed by musical therapy back in Venice and spiritual hydraulics in Bavaria. By the time he completed his therapeutic tour, Count Alessandro had been subjected to virtually every known treatment for sadness and had somehow managed to survive the experience, though contemporary accounts suggest he emerged from the process convinced that he was simultaneously a bear, a musical instrument, and a weather system. Count Alessandro's therapeutic journey was meticulously documented in travel journals that provide fascinating insights into the international network of melancholia specialists. His accounts describe the different cultural approaches to sadness treatment, noting that German practitioners emphasized efficiency and precision. Italian specialists focused on artistic elegance, French therapists preferred theoretical sophistication. And Russian doctors favored dramatic intensity in their interventions. The cultural context that made these treatments possible was a society that had absolute faith in the power of systematic intervention to solve any human problem. Daily life in 18th century Europe was organized around the principle that everything in the universe operated according to discoverable laws, and that these laws could be manipulated through proper technique and sufficient determination. If you could calculate the orbits of planets and design machines to harness the power of water and wind, then obviously you could engineer the perfect emotional state through the application of scientific principles to human anatomy and psychology. This worldview extended to every aspect of medical practice. Physicians weren't just treating individual symptoms. They were essentially cosmic engineers, adjusting the fundamental forces that governed human existence. The fact that their patients frequently died or went insane was seen as evidence of the complexity of the task rather than any fundamental flaw in the approach. It was perfectly normal for a doctor to prescribe a treatment that involved drilling holes in someone's head, draining their blood, exposing them to controlled explosions, and forcing them to live with bears. Because all of these interventions were based on sophisticated, theoretical frameworks that had been developed by learned scholars at prestigious universities. The most fascinating aspect of this period was how the various treatment approaches had developed their own internal logic that made them seem perfectly reasonable to contemporary practitioners. Dr. Marcello's musical therapy wasn't just random noise. He had developed detailed charts showing the correspondence between specific musical intervals and particular humoral states. Professor Volkonsky's weather chambers weren't arbitrary environmental manipulation. They were based on extensive observations of how atmospheric conditions affected emotional states in different types of patients. Perhaps most ironic was how these elaborate treatment systems had created their own form of institutional sadness. The medical community had become so invested in their various therapeutic approaches that they had lost sight of the fact that their treatments were often worse than the original problems they were trying to solve. Doctors would spend months preparing elaborate treatment protocols for patients who might have recovered naturally if left alone. But the medical establishment had created a culture where doing nothing was considered professionally irresponsible. The economic incentives reinforced this pattern because the most prestigious physicians were those who had developed the most complex and expensive treatments. Simple remedies like rest, good food, and human companionship couldn't support the elaborate medical infrastructure that had grown up around melancholia treatment. Universities needed to justify their melancholia studies programs. Equipment manufacturers needed to sell their therapeutic devices, and the medical profession needed to demonstrate that their expertise was worth the enormous fees they charged. This created a feedback loop where medical innovation was driven not by effectiveness but by novelty and complexity. Each new generation of physicians needed to develop treatments that were more sophisticated than their predecessors, leading to an escalating arms race of therapeutic creativity that had completely lost touch with any practical consideration of whether these treatments actually helped patients feel better. Everything changed when Dr. Philippe Pinel walked into the Bicêtre Hospital in Paris in 1793 and had what can only be described as a radical attack of common sense. Dr. Pinel looked around at the elaborate contraptions, the drilling equipment, the humoral drainage systems, and the various therapeutic animals, and apparently thought to himself, "You know what? Maybe we're overthinking this whole sadness thing." His revolutionary idea was so simple, it was almost insulting to centuries of medical innovation. What if we just treated sad people with basic human kindness and see what happens? This moment represents one of the most dramatic paradigm shifts in medical history, the transition from elaborate torture disguised as treatment to maybe we should try not making things worse. But the process of change wasn't immediate or easy, because Dr. Pinel was essentially suggesting that the entire medical establishment had been going in completely the wrong direction for about 500 years, which is the kind of professional criticism that tends to make people defensive. Dr. Pinel's background made his revolutionary approach even more surprising. He had been trained in traditional medical methods and was thoroughly familiar with the elaborate theoretical frameworks that supported conventional melancholia treatment. He had studied at the University of Montpellier, one of Europe's most prestigious medical schools, where he had learned the latest techniques in humoral rebalancing, cranial modification, and environmental therapy. His credentials were impeccable, and his early career had followed the expected path of a successful physician specializing in melancholic disorders. But Dr. Pinel had begun to notice disturbing patterns in the outcomes of conventional treatments. Despite the sophisticated theoretical frameworks and elaborate equipment, patients didn't seem to be getting better. In fact, many appeared to be getting worse. The most advanced and expensive treatments often produce the most severe complications, while patients who received minimal intervention sometimes recovered on their own. This observation led him to begin questioning the fundamental assumptions underlying the entire melancholia treatment. Dr. Pinel's approach was based on his observations that patients seemed to improve more when they were treated as human beings rather than as complex mechanical problems requiring technical solutions. He had noticed that patients who were spoken to respectfully, given adequate food and shelter, and allowed to maintain some dignity tended to recover more quickly than those subjected to comprehensive therapeutic intervention. This was such a revolutionary concept that it initially met with fierce resistance from the medical community, who had invested considerable time and money in developing their various skull drilling and humeral rebalancing specialties. The resistance to Pinel's approach came from multiple directions, each representing different vested interests in maintaining the existing system. The traditional medical establishment argued that his methods were unscientific because they didn't involve any sophisticated theoretical frameworks or specialized equipment. University medical faculties worried that if treating sadness could be accomplished through simple human kindness, there would be no need for their elaborate melancholia studies programs. Equipment manufacturers were concerned about the market for therapeutic drilling devices and humeral circulation apparatus. Perhaps the strongest opposition came from patients' families, who had been conditioned to expect that effective medical treatment should be complex, expensive, and somewhat dangerous. The idea that their loved ones could be helped through simple environmental improvements and respectful conversation seemed almost insulting after they had spent fortunes on comprehensive therapeutic protocols. Some families actually demanded that Dr. Pinel include at least some skull drilling in his treatment plans, just to make them feel like they were getting their money's worth. The economic implications of Dr. Pinel's approach were enormous and threatening to the established medical order. If depression could be treated through basic human care, rather than elaborate professional interventions, entire industries would become obsolete overnight. The manufacturers of trepanation equipment, humeral circulation devices, and therapeutic environmental apparatus faced the prospect of complete market collapse. Medical schools would need to completely restructure their curricula, eliminating profitable specialized programs in favor of much simpler training approaches. The process of implementing Pinel's reforms was complicated by the fact that many patients had been so traumatized by previous treatments that they initially assumed his kindness was some kind of elaborate psychological manipulation designed to make them more vulnerable to future therapeutic interventions. Patients would flinch when staff members approached them without drilling equipment, convinced that the real treatment was being hidden until they let their guard down. Some patients actually requested to be subjected to traditional treatments because they had been conditioned to believe that effective medicine had to involve significant suffering. Dr. Penal had to develop new training programs for hospital staff, teaching them revolutionary techniques like listening to patients and not immediately assuming that sadness requires surgical intervention. These skills were surprisingly difficult for medical professionals to master, since they had been trained to view every human emotion as a technical problem requiring systematic solution. Many physicians struggled with the concept that sometimes the most therapeutic thing they could do was absolutely nothing. The retraining process involved fundamental changes in how medical professionals thought about their role and expertise. Instead of being cosmic engineers who manipulated invisible forces to repair broken human machinery, they needed to become supporters and facilitators who helped create conditions where people could heal themselves. This required a completely different set of skills and a much more humble understanding of medical intervention. Dr. Penal's approach also required significant changes in hospital design and operation. The elaborate therapeutic facilities with their complex equipment and specialized chambers needed to be replaced with simple, comfortable environments that prioritized human dignity over scientific sophistication. The carefully orchestrated treatment protocols, involving precise timing and complex procedures, were replaced with flexible approaches that could be adapted to individual patient needs and preferences. The breakthrough came when Dr. Penal began documenting his results and comparing them to the outcomes from traditional melancholia treatments. His simple approach of providing clean environments, adequate nutrition, respectful conversation, and meaningful activities resulted in significantly higher recovery rates than the elaborate therapeutic protocols that have been considered state-of-the-art medicine. Even more importantly, his patients recovered without the brain damage, blood loss, poisoning, and animal-related injuries that were common side effects of conventional treatment. The documentation process was crucial for overcoming resistance to Penal's methods. He maintained detailed records of patient outcomes, tracking recovery rates, treatment complications, and long-term prognosis for both his humane approach and traditional methods. The data was overwhelming. Patients treated with kindness and respect consistently show better outcomes than those subjected to elaborate therapeutic interventions, and they achieved these results at a fraction of the cost and risk. But the most revolutionary aspect of Penal's approach was his recognition that sadness might actually be a normal human response to difficult circumstances rather than a medical pathology requiring aggressive intervention. This idea was so radical that it threatened the fundamental assumptions underlying the entire melancholia treatment industry. If sadness was sometimes an appropriate emotional response to genuinely sad situations, then maybe the problem wasn't with the patient's humoral circulation or cranial pressure. Maybe the problem was with their life circumstances. This insight led to the development of what we might recognize as the first primitive forms of social work and psychological counseling. Instead of assuming that depressed patients needed their bodies modified through drilling, bleeding, or chemical intervention, Dr. Penal began investigating whether their sadness might be related to problems like poverty, social isolation, abusive relationships, or meaningless work. His treatment plans began including practical interventions like helping patients find better living situations, meaningful employment, or supportive social connections. The social approach to treating depression represented a fundamental challenge to the medical model that had dominated melancholia treatment for centuries. Instead of focusing exclusively on biological and mechanical interventions, Dr. Penal's methods acknowledged that human emotional well-being was influenced by social, economic, and environmental factors that couldn't be addressed through medical procedures alone. Dr. Penal's staff began working with patients to identify practical problems that might be contributing to their depression and to develop realistic solutions that could be implemented after their recovery. This approach required medical professionals to develop new skills in problem solving, social analysis, and practical life management that had never been part of traditional medical training. The new reality that emerged from Pinel's reforms was a medical system that actually seemed designed to help patients rather than provide employment opportunities for specialists in therapeutic skull modification. Hospitals began to resemble what we would recognize as healing environments rather than elaborate torture facilities decorated with scientific instruments. Staff were trained to view patients as people with problems rather than as broken machines requiring expert repair. The transformation involved changes in every aspect of hospital operation, from the physical environment to staff training to treatment protocols. Patients were given comfortable clothing instead of restraints, adequate food instead of specialized humoral optimization diets, and opportunities for meaningful activity instead of elaborate therapeutic interventions. The results were dramatic and immediate. Patient behavior improved, recovery rates increased, and the horrific complications associated with traditional treatments disappeared almost entirely. The economic implications of this transformation were enormous. The market for therapeutic drilling equipment collapsed almost overnight, along with the industries that had grown up around humoral circulation devices, environmental therapy architecture, and therapeutic animal training. Entire university departments dedicated to advanced melancholia studies found themselves without purpose, while medical textbook publishers had to completely revise their catalogs to remove centuries of accumulated wisdom about the proper techniques. For drilling holes in sad people's heads, was this change an improvement? From the perspective of people who suffered from depression, the answer was obviously yes. They were significantly less likely to die from their treatment, and much more likely to actually feel better afterward. From the perspective of the medical establishment, the answer was more complicated. Many physicians had built their entire careers around elaborate therapeutic specialties that were suddenly considered not just ineffective, but actively harmful. The transformation also created new challenges for the medical profession. If treating sadness didn't require years of specialized training in humoral theory and cranial drilling techniques, then what exactly was the value of medical expertise in mental health treatment? The profession had to completely reconceptualize its role from cosmic engineers of human emotional states to something much more modest and practical. The resistance to change was particularly strong among established practitioners who had invested decades in developing expertise in traditional methods. Many physicians found it difficult to accept that their sophisticated theoretical knowledge and specialized technical skills were not only unnecessary but counterproductive. Some continued practicing traditional approaches in private, while others attempted to rebrand their methods as complementary to Pinel's humane treatment. But perhaps the most significant aspect of this change was how it revealed the extent to which the previous medical approaches had been driven by intellectual pride, rather than genuine concern for patient welfare. The elaborate theoretical frameworks and sophisticated equipment had served primarily to make physicians feel like they were doing something important and scientifically advanced, while the actual effects on patients had been largely ignored or rationalized away when the results were disappointing. In the years and decades that followed Pinel's reforms, the medical community faced the challenging task of figuring out what to do with all their expertise in therapeutic skull drilling. Now that treating sadness with basic human decency had proven to be surprisingly effective, the transition period was marked by what historians call adaptive therapeutic innovation. Essentially, doctors trying to find new ways to make simple treatments more complicated, so they could continue charging professional fees for their services. The medical establishment's response to Pinel's success was a fascinating study in professional adaptation and resistance to change. Rather than immediately abandoning their traditional approaches, Many physicians attempted to incorporate elements of humane treatment into their existing therapeutic frameworks. This led to the development of what they called integrated melancholia management, essentially trying to combine skull drilling with kindness, humoral rebalancing with respect, and environmental manipulation with basic human dignity. Some physicians attempted to rebrand their traditional approaches as complementary interventions to be used alongside Pennell's humane methods. Dr. Heinrich Bormann, a German specialist who had built his reputation on precision trepanation techniques, began offering what he called prophylactic cranial ventilation, essentially drilling holes in people's heads before they became depressed, as a form of emotional insurance policy. His marketing materials explained that while Pennell's methods might help people who were already sad, Dr. Bormann's approach could prevent sadness from developing in the first place by ensuring optimal cranial drainage from the beginning. Dr. Bormann's preventive approach represented a clever adaptation to the changing medical landscape. Instead of competing directly with Pennell's proven methods for treating existing depression, he repositioned his skull drilling expertise as a preventive measure that could be marketed to healthy people who wanted to avoid future emotional problems. This allowed him to maintain his specialized practice while acknowledging the effectiveness of humane treatment for active cases of melancholia. The market for preventive skull drilling proved surprisingly robust, particularly among wealthy families who wanted to protect their children from future melancholic episodes. Dr. Bormann developed specialized pediatric drilling equipment and established what he called youth cranial optimization centers, where parents could bring their teenagers for what the marketing materials described as emotional preparedness procedures. The fact that many of these preemptively drilled young people later developed severe anxiety disorders was attributed to insufficient cranial aperture sizing rather than any fundamental problem with the approach. Dr. Bormann's youth centers became fashionable among the wealthy, who viewed preventive cranial modification as a progressive, scientifically advanced approach to child rearing. The procedures were presented as educational experiences that would help young people understand the importance of proper cranial hygiene and emotional maintenance. Parents would often schedule drilling sessions as part of their children's broader education, along with language lessons, music instruction, and dancing classes. Meanwhile, Dr. Cornelius van Houten had pivoted his sensory optimization practice toward what he called environmental wellness consulting. Instead of treating depressed patients in elaborate therapeutic chambers, he began designing entire homes and workplaces according to principles of humoral architecture. Wealthy clients would hire Dr. Van Houten to redesign their living spaces with the proper colors, sounds, and spatial relationships to prevent depression from developing. His consulting firm, Optimized Living Environments Limited, became highly successful among the merchant classes who appreciated the idea of purchasing long-term emotional stability through superior interior decoration. Dr. Van Houten's environmental consulting represented another form of medical adaptation to the post-Pennell landscape. Rather than abandoning his expertise in sensory optimization, he found ways to apply it to prevention and lifestyle enhancement rather than active treatment. This allowed him to maintain his professional identity while avoiding direct competition with the increasingly popular humane treatment approaches. The environmental wellness movement created an entirely new market for medical expertise that didn't directly compete with Pennell's methods. Clients could pursue both humane treatment for existing emotional problems and environmental optimization for long-term prevention, allowing traditional specialists to maintain their practices while acknowledging the value of simpler therapeutic approaches. But the most significant development during this period was the emergence of new players who had never been part of the traditional melancholia treatment establishment. These were practitioners who had been working with different approaches to mental health, often religious or philosophical rather than medical. and who suddenly found themselves in a position to offer alternatives to both the old drilling methods and the new humane treatment approaches. Father Giuseppe Benedetti, a Jesuit priest working in Rome, had developed what he called spiritual therapeutic consultation, essentially the precursor to modern pastoral counseling. Father Benedetti's approach was based on the radical idea that people's emotional problems might be related to spiritual or moral conflicts, rather than humoral imbalances or insufficient cranial ventilation. His method involved extended conversations with troubled individuals, focusing on helping them understand the relationship between their beliefs, their behavior, and their emotional states. Father Benedetti's background in theology and philosophy gave him a different perspective on human emotional distress than medical practitioners had typically offered. Instead of viewing sadness as a technical malfunction requiring expert repair, he understood depression as often reflecting deeper questions about meaning, purpose, and moral direction that couldn't be addressed through physical interventions. Alone, what made Father Benedetti's approach particularly innovative was his recognition that many people's sadness was connected to genuine moral or spiritual problems that couldn't be solved through medical intervention. Unlike the medical establishment, which had consistently treated sadness as a technical malfunction requiring expert repair, Father Benedetti understood that sometimes people were depressed because they were living in ways that conflicted with their deepest values, and that this kind of sadness required moral and spiritual guidance rather than therapeutic drilling. Father Benedetti's consultation process involved extensive conversations about the patient's life circumstances, moral concerns, and spiritual beliefs. He had developed techniques for helping people identify conflicts between their stated values and their actual behavior, and for exploring how these conflicts might be contributing to their emotional distress. His approach was based on the idea that emotional healing often required moral and spiritual transformation rather than just symptom relief. The success of Father Benedetti's spiritual approach demonstrated that there were alternatives to both traditional medical treatment and penal's humane methods. His consultations attracted clients who were looking for something more than just symptom relief. They wanted to understand the deeper meaning of their emotional experiences and to develop approaches to living that would support long-term emotional well-being. Being Professor Johann Pestalozzi, working in Switzerland, had developed a completely different approach based on educational theory. Professor Pestalozzi believed that much of what the medical community called melancholia was actually the result of intellectual and creative stagnation. His treatment programs involved what he called mental cultivation therapy, structured educational activities designed to engage patients' intellectual curiosity and creative capacities. Instead of drilling holes or rebalancing humors, Professor Pestalozzi prescribed reading, writing, mathematical problem-solving, and artistic projects as treatments for depression. Professor Pestalozzi's educational approach was based on his observations that many depressed patients seemed to improve when given interesting problems to solve and meaningful projects to work on. He had noticed that intellectual engagement and creative activity often produced dramatic improvements in mood and overall functioning, suggesting that boredom and mental stagnation might be significant factors in many cases of depression. Professor Pestalozzi's educational approach proved remarkably effective, particularly with patients whose depression seemed related to boredom, lack of purpose, or intellectual isolation. His programs demonstrated that many people who had been diagnosed with complex melancholic disorders actually recovered quite rapidly when given interesting problems to solve and meaningful projects to work on. This was another revolutionary insight: the idea that human beings might need intellectual stimulation and creative challenges for optimal emotional health. The educational treatment programs involved carefully structured activities designed to gradually rebuild patients' confidence in their intellectual and creative abilities. Patients would start with simple, engaging tasks that provided immediate feedback and satisfaction, then progress to more complex projects that required sustained effort and creative problem-solving. The goal was to help patients rediscover their capacity for learning, growth, and creative expression. But some problems persisted despite these innovations. The medical profession's approach to mental health treatment continued to be dominated by the assumption that emotional problems required expert intervention rather than personal agency. Even Panel's humane treatment methods were still fundamentally based on the idea that sadness was something that happened to patients, rather than something they might be able to influence through their own choices and actions. This created an ongoing tension between the newer therapeutic approaches, which emphasized professional expertise and institutional treatment, and alternative approaches that focused on helping people develop their own capacity for emotional self-regulation. The medical establishment remained committed to the idea that depression was a condition that required diagnosis and treatment by qualified professionals, while practitioners like Father Benedetti and Professor Pestalozzi were developing methods that emphasized education, personal responsibility, and community support. The most persistent challenge was the economic structure of the emerging mental health treatment industry. Even after the abandonment of skull drilling and humoral rebalancing, the medical profession needed to maintain revenue streams for melancholia treatment. This led to the development of increasingly elaborate diagnostic categories and treatment protocols that, while less dangerous than traditional approaches, still emphasized the need for expensive professional intervention over simpler solutions that patients might implement themselves. Dr. Franz Mesmer had begun developing what he called animal magnetism therapy, a sophisticated theoretical framework involving invisible magnetic forces that required specially trained practitioners to manipulate through complex procedures involving magnets, special hand movements, and what he called magnetic healing techniques. While Mesmer's approach didn't involve drilling holes in patients' heads, it still maintained the fundamental structure of expert practitioners using specialized knowledge to manipulate invisible forces affecting patients' emotional states. Mesmer's magnetic therapy represented a new form of medical complexity that could coexist with Pinel's humane approaches while maintaining the professional authority and economic structure that traditional medicine had depended upon. Patients could receive both humane treatment for immediate symptom relief and magnetic therapy for deeper healing of invisible magnetic imbalances, allowing the medical profession to maintain its expertise-based business model while acknowledging the value of simpler approaches. Compared to the earlier period of therapeutic skull drilling, these later developments represented significant progress in terms of patient safety and treatment effectiveness. People were much less likely to die from their depression treatment, and many of the newer approaches actually seemed to help patients feel better. However, the underlying assumption that emotional problems required expert professional intervention remained largely unchanged, setting the stage for the development of modern psychiatry and psychology as medical specialties rather than educational or spiritual practices. The pattern that emerged during this period was the gradual medicalization of sadness as a technical problem requiring professional solutions, even as the specific technical solutions became less dangerous and more effective. While patients were no longer being subjected to therapeutic drilling, they were increasingly being taught to view their emotional states as medical conditions requiring ongoing professional management rather than natural human experiences that could be addressed through personal growth, social support, and practical life changes. By the mid-19th century, signs pointed to the end of an era in sadness treatment, though not necessarily the end of medical professionals finding creative ways to make things more complicated than they needed to be. The warning signs were everywhere if you knew where to look. Medical journals were publishing studies showing that patients treated with simple rest and conversation recovered faster than those subjected to elaborate therapeutic interventions. Insurance companies were beginning to question the cost-effectiveness of comprehensive melancholia protocols. And most tellingly, physicians themselves were increasingly reluctant to subject their own family members to the treatments they prescribed for their patients. The medical establishment had reached a point where the contradictions between theory and practice had become impossible to ignore. Professional conferences that had once featured excited presentations about new drilling techniques and innovative humeral rebalancing methods were increasingly dominated by heated debates about treatment effectiveness and patient outcomes. Young physicians entering the field were questioning the elaborate theoretical frameworks they were being taught. While established Section 8 by the mid-19th century, signs pointed to the end of an era in sadness treatment, though not necessarily the end of medical professionals finding creative ways to make things more complicated than they needed to be. The warning signs were everywhere if you knew where to look. Medical journals were publishing studies showing that patients treated with simple rest and conversation recovered faster than those subjected to elaborate therapeutic interventions. Insurance companies were beginning to question the cost-effectiveness of comprehensive melancholia protocols, and most tellingly, physicians themselves were increasingly reluctant to subject their own family members to the treatments they prescribed for their patients. Dr. Wilhelm Griesinger, working in Germany, had begun publishing research that would fundamentally challenge the theoretical foundations of traditional melancholia treatment. His studies showed that patients' recovery rates were inversely correlated with the complexity of their treatment. The more elaborate the therapeutic intervention, the less likely patients were to actually get better. This was devastating news for the medical establishment, which had spent centuries developing increasingly sophisticated approaches to depression. Treatment based on the assumption that more complex treatments were necessarily more effective. But the medical community's resistance to these findings was formidable. Dr. Maximilian von Oberstein, now in his 70s and still practicing his comprehensive melancholic intervention protocols, published a series of angry responses to Dr. Griesinger's research. Von Oberstein argued that the apparent simplicity of effective treatments was actually evidence of their sophisticated underlying mechanisms, essentially claiming that treatments that looked simple were actually so advanced that only experts could understand their complexity. The end of the traditional melancholia treatment era came not through a single dramatic moment, but through a gradual process of what historians call therapeutic exhaustion. By the 1850s, the medical community had explored virtually every possible way to make sadness treatment more complicated, expensive, and dangerous. They had drilled holes, drained fluids, rearranged environments, manipulated weather patterns, employed therapeutic animals, and developed elaborate theoretical frameworks to explain why all of these approaches should work. The problem was that simpler approaches consistently produced better results. The final major attempt to preserve traditional melancholia treatment came in 1863, when the International Society for Advanced Therapeutic Intervention organized what they called the Great Melancholia Summit in Vienna. This was intended to be a comprehensive evaluation of all existing approaches to depression treatment, with the goal of developing a unified theoretical framework that would incorporate the best elements of each method while eliminating the approaches that had proven ineffective. The summit brought together representatives of every major school of melancholia treatment, the traditional trepanation specialists, the humeral rebalancing experts, the environmental therapists, the zoological intervention practitioners, the musical therapy advocates, and the emerging humane treatment faction led by followers of Dr. Pinel. The plan was to spend a month conducting controlled comparisons of different treatment approaches using volunteer patients, followed by the development of consensus guidelines for optimal melancholia treatment. The results were a disaster for the traditional medical establishment. Patient after patient showed faster recovery with simple approaches involving rest, nutrition, social support, and meaningful activity, while the elaborate traditional treatments consistently produced worse outcomes. The trepanation specialists watched helplessly as their carefully drilled patients remained depressed while others recovered through basic environmental improvements. The humoral rebalancing experts saw their extensively bled and purged patients continue to suffer while those receiving simple kindness began to smile again. But perhaps the most devastating moment came when Dr. Edward Hitzig, a young physician attending the summit, stood up during the final session and asked a simple question. If our goal is to help sad people feel better, and simple approaches consistently work better than complex ones, then why are we still trying to justify the complex approaches? The room fell silent as 200 years of medical tradition suddenly had to confront the possibility that they had been not just wrong, but spectacularly, dangerously wrong. Why did the traditional era end? The analysis reveals multiple converging factors that made change inevitable. Internal problems included the obvious disconnect between theoretical sophistication and practical results. It became impossible to ignore that elaborate treatments were consistently less effective than simple ones. External pressures came from patients' families, who were increasingly unwilling to pay high fees for treatments that made their loved ones worse, and from emerging insurance systems that demanded evidence of treatment effectiveness. The role of individual physicians versus broader historical forces is fascinating to consider. Dr. Pennell and his followers certainly played important roles in demonstrating alternative approaches, but the traditional system might have collapsed anyway. Under the weight of its own contradictions, the elaborate theoretical frameworks had become so complex that they required increasingly absurd explanations for why they weren't working, while the practical evidence against them became impossible to ignore. What could have been done differently? The medical establishment could have maintained their professional authority while adopting more effective treatment methods, but this would have required abandoning the entire economic model that had developed around complex therapeutic interventions. It would also have required admitting that centuries of medical education and research had been fundamentally misdirected, which is the kind of professional humility that institutions rarely demonstrate voluntarily. The question of inevitability versus contingency is particularly interesting. Was the traditional system doomed to fail because it was based on false assumptions about the nature of sadness? Or could it have been reformed and maintained if different choices had been made? The evidence suggests that the contradiction between theory and practice had become so extreme that some form of transformation was inevitable, though the specific direction of that transformation depended on the actions of individuals like Dr. Pennell, who offered practical alternatives. The immediate aftermath of the traditional system's collapse was chaos mixed with relief. Hospitals across Europe had to completely redesign their melancholia treatment facilities, removing the drilling equipment, dismantling the humoral circulation apparatus, and finding new homes for the therapeutic animals. Medical schools had to revise their curricula, eliminating courses in advanced trepanation techniques and humoral rebalancing theory, while developing new programs focused on what was becoming known as psychological medicine. Who stepped into the vacuum left by the collapse of traditional melancholia treatment? Initially, it was a mixture of reformed physicians who had adopted Pennell's humane approaches, religious practitioners who had been working with spiritual counseling methods, and educators who had developed programs based on intellectual and creative engagement. This diversity of approaches created a more flexible and responsive system, but also led to new forms of professional competition as different groups sought to establish authority over mental health treatment. The short-term consequences included a dramatic improvement in patient outcomes, as people suffering from depression were no longer subjected to treatments that were more dangerous than their original conditions. There was also significant economic disruption as entire industries built around. Traditional melancholia treatment disappeared almost overnight. Contemporary reactions were mixed. Patients and families were generally relieved, while medical professionals struggled to adapt their practices and maintain their authority in a rapidly changing field. Some attempts at revival or continuation of traditional approaches did occur. Dr. von Oberstein continued practicing his comprehensive protocols until his death in 1867, claiming that his methods were simply ahead of their time and would eventually be vindicated by future medical research. Several medical schools maintained historical melancholia studies programs well into the 1870s, though these were increasingly viewed as academic curiosities rather than practical training for medical practice. The legacy of historical melancholia treatment shaped the development of modern psychiatry and psychology in ways that continue to influence how we think about mental health today. The most significant impact was the establishment of the fundamental principle that seemed revolutionary at the time, but now appears obvious. Maybe we should try not to make sad people's lives worse while attempting to help them. This principle, born from the spectacular failures of skull drilling and humeral rebalancing, became the foundation for what we now call first, do no harm in mental health treatment. But the historical influence runs deeper than just safety considerations. The elaborate theoretical frameworks developed by medieval and Renaissance physicians established a pattern of medicalizing emotional experiences that persists in modern psychiatric practice. While we no longer believe that sadness is caused by trapped humors or cranial pressure imbalances, we've maintained the basic assumption that depression is fundamentally a medical condition, requiring professional diagnosis and treatment rather than a normal human response to difficult circumstances that people might address through personal and social resources. The transition from drilling holes in people's heads to prescribing antidepressant medications represents a clear improvement in terms of immediate physical safety, but the underlying logic remains remarkably similar. Both approaches are based on the idea that sadness results from biochemical imbalances that can be corrected through expert intervention. Modern psychiatrists may not use trepanation equipment, but they still approach depression as a technical problem requiring specialized knowledge to manipulate invisible forces affecting patients' emotional states. The myths that developed around historical melancholia treatment have become part of our cultural understanding of medical progress. We tell stories about the bad old days when doctors drilled holes in people's heads, using these historical examples to demonstrate how far medical science has advanced. But these narratives often obscure the continuities between historical and modern approaches, particularly the persistent assumption that emotional problems require professional medical management rather than personal agency and social support. The reality is that many of the most effective elements of historical treatment, the emphasis on environmental factors, social connections, meaningful activity, and spiritual considerations, were actually abandoned along with the drilling and bleeding. Modern psychiatric practice has become increasingly focused on pharmaceutical interventions and standardized therapeutic protocols, often neglecting the holistic approaches that even medieval practitioners understood were important for human emotional well-being. Today, we can see echoes of historical melancholia treatment in numerous contemporary examples. The modern pharmaceutical industry's approach to mental health treatment bears striking similarities to the elaborate theoretical frameworks developed by Renaissance physicians. Both involve complex explanations of invisible biochemical processes. Both require expensive specialized interventions administered by trained professionals, and both tend to ignore simpler explanations and solutions in favor of sophisticated technical approaches. consider the current practice of treating childhood depression with psychiatric medications. The underlying logic is remarkably similar to Dr. Fabricius's humoral rebalancing protocols. The assumption that emotional problems result from chemical imbalances that can be corrected through expert manipulation of the patient's biochemistry. While modern medications are obviously safer than medieval purging and bloodletting, the basic approach of treating sadness through chemical intervention rather than addressing environmental and social factors remains consistent. The modern emphasis on psychiatric diagnosis and classification systems also reflects the historical pattern of creating elaborate theoretical frameworks to explain emotional experiences. The current Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, with its hundreds of specific diagnostic categories and criteria, represents a direct continuation of the medieval practice of developing complex classification systems for different types of sadness and their corresponding treatments. What hasn't changed about human nature is our tendency to prefer complex, expensive solutions over simple, practical ones, especially when the complex solutions are offered by credentialed experts. Using impressive-sounding scientific language, modern patients often report feeling more confident about treatments that involve sophisticated diagnostic procedures and cutting-edge pharmaceutical interventions than about simple approaches involving lifestyle changes, social support, and practical problem-solving. The pattern of professional specialization that began with medieval melancholia specialists continues in modern mental health treatment, where patients are often shuttled between psychiatrists, psychologists, social workers, and various types of counselors, each with their own theoretical frameworks and intervention techniques. While this specialization has certainly improved treatment outcomes compared to skull drilling, it has also maintained the basic structure of expert-dependent professional services rather than empowering people to develop their own emotional self-regulation skills. Perhaps most significantly, the historical emphasis on treating sadness as an individual pathology, rather than a social or spiritual concern, continues to influence how we think about mental health. Modern psychiatric practice focuses primarily on changing individuals through medication or therapy, rather than addressing the social, economic, and cultural factors that contribute to widespread depression and anxiety in contemporary society. The lessons for contemporary issues are both encouraging and concerning. On the positive side, the historical record demonstrates that even deeply entrenched medical practices can be reformed when evidence clearly shows they're not working. The transition from skull drilling to humane treatment happened relatively quickly once the medical community was forced to confront the evidence about treatment outcomes. But the historical pattern also suggests that medical institutions have a strong tendency to maintain their authority and economic interests, even when simpler, more effective approaches are available. The development of increasingly complex theoretical frameworks and specialized interventions often serves professional interests better than patient interests, creating resistance to reforms that might reduce the need for expert medical intervention. Modern parallels to historical melancholia treatment can be found in the current debates about the effectiveness of psychiatric medications, the medicalization of normal human emotions, and the relative importance of pharmaceutical interventions versus social and environmental factors in mental health treatment. Just as medieval physicians insisted that their elaborate drilling procedures were scientifically validated despite evidence to the contrary, modern psychiatric practitioners sometimes resist acknowledging the limitations of current treatment approaches or the potential value of simpler alternatives. The continuing influence of historical approaches can be seen in how mental health treatment remains largely separated from other aspects of human well-being. Medieval physicians understood that sadness could be influenced by spiritual, social, environmental, and physical factors, but they tried to address these through elaborate medical interventions rather than practical life changes. Modern psychiatric practice has maintained this separation between emotional problems and everyday life circumstances, treating depression as a medical condition rather than as often reflecting genuine problems with how people are living their lives. Looking back across this entire journey through the wonderfully bizarre world of historical sadness treatment, we've seen how human ingenuity, when combined with absolute confidence and complete ignorance, can produce truly spectacular results, just not the ones anyone intended. The results were devastating to everything Dr. Zimmermann had believed about medical treatment. The patients receiving simple humane care recovered faster, reported higher satisfaction with their treatment, and showed significantly lower rates of what we would now recognize as treatment-related trauma. Meanwhile, the patients subjected to his comprehensive integrated protocols continued to experience the elaborate side effects he had been attributing to therapeutic adjustment responses. Essentially, they were getting worse because of the treatment, not better despite it. What makes Dr. Zimmermann's story particularly poignant is his response to these findings. Rather than defending his methods or dismissing the results, he spent the final years of his career dismantling his elaborate therapeutic facility and retraining his staff in humane treatment approaches. His published account of this transition, titled Reflections on 20 Years of Therapeutic Enthusiasm, became one of the most influential documents in the history of mental health treatment reform. In his final paper, Dr. Zimmermann wrote, "I have spent my career developing increasingly sophisticated methods for treating human sadness, convinced that complexity and scientific rigor were synonymous. I have learned, to my great humility, that the most profound medical discovery is often the recognition that our elaborate interventions are unnecessary, and that the greatest therapeutic skill lies in knowing when to do nothing except provide the basic conditions that allow human beings to heal themselves." This story reveals something fundamental about the nature of medical progress and human wisdom. Sometimes the most advanced understanding comes not from adding more complexity to our approaches, but from having the courage to acknowledge that simpler methods work better. Sometimes the greatest expertise lies not in developing more sophisticated interventions, but in recognizing when sophisticated interventions are counterproductive. The broader implications of this historical journey extend far beyond the specific question of how to treat sadness. The patterns we've observed, the tendency to medicalize normal human experiences, the preference for complex professional solutions over simple personal ones, the resistance to acknowledging when established practices aren't working, appear throughout human institutions and continue to influence how we approach problems in medicine, education, politics, and other fields. The gentle conclusion to our exploration is the recognition that human beings have always struggled with sadness, and that the most effective responses have consistently involved the simplest human elements: kindness, understanding, social connection, meaningful activity, and the basic respect for human dignity that allows people to maintain agency over their own lives. The elaborate medical interventions we've discussed were often attempts to systematize and professionalize these simple human responses, but the systematization frequently destroyed the very qualities that made the responses effective. Perhaps the most valuable insight from this historical journey is the importance of maintaining humility about our own contemporary approaches to human problems. While we've clearly made progress from the days of therapeutic skull drilling, we should remember that every previous generation was equally convinced that their methods represented enlightened scientific progress compared to the obviously flawed approaches of their predecessors. The invitation to reflection that emerges from this story is to consider how we might apply the lessons of medical history to our own approaches to emotional well-being. Instead of immediately seeking complex professional interventions for sadness, we might first try the simple approaches that have consistently proven most effective. improving our life circumstances when possible, maintaining supportive relationships, engaging in meaningful activities, taking care of our physical health, and remembering that sadness is often a normal and appropriate response to genuinely difficult situations rather than a medical pathology, requiring expert intervention. And with that peaceful thought, we reach the end of our journey through the amusing, instructive, and occasionally horrifying world of historical melancholia treatment. The next time you're feeling sad, you can at least take comfort in the knowledge that no one is likely to suggest drilling holes in your head as a therapeutic intervention, which represents genuine progress in human civilization, even if everything else about treating emotional distress remains surprisingly complicated. Key patterns that emerge from centuries of melancholia treatment are both hilarious and deeply instructive. The persistent human tendency to prefer complex explanations over simple ones. The remarkable capacity for intelligent people to rationalize obviously ineffective practices. And the eternal struggle between professional expertise and common sense. The most surprising discovery throughout this exploration has been how consistently the most elaborate and sophisticated treatments produce the worst outcomes, while the simplest approaches, basic kindness, adequate nutrition, social support, and meaningful activity, consistently proved most effective. This pattern, repeated across centuries, cultures, and different theoretical frameworks, suggesting something fundamental about human nature and the treatment of emotional distress that transcends specific historical contexts. Perhaps the most important takeaway is the recognition that medical progress isn't always linear or rational. The transition from skull drilling to humane treatment didn't happen because doctors gradually refined their techniques and theories until they achieved optimal results. Instead, it required abandoning entire systems of thought and practice that had been developed by brilliant, well-educated people working within prestigious institutions. Sometimes the biggest advances come not from improving existing approaches but from questioning whether those approaches make any sense in the first place. The evolution of our understanding has been particularly fascinating to trace. Each generation of physicians was absolutely convinced that they had figured out the true nature of sadness and had developed scientifically valid treatments based on the latest theoretical advances. Medieval doctors weren't randomly drilling holes in people's heads. They had detailed anatomical theories about cranial pressure and humeral circulation. Renaissance physicians weren't arbitrarily bleeding and purging patients. They had sophisticated frameworks explaining the relationship between bodily fluids and emotional states. What's both amusing and sobering is how each era looked back at previous approaches with a mixture of condescension and amazement, wondering how earlier physicians could have been so misguided, while remaining completely blind to the problems with their own methods. The skull drillers thought the humeral rebalancers were primitive and unscientific. The environmental therapists considered both previous approaches to be crude and unsophisticated. The humane treatment advocates viewed all previous methods as vicious, barbaric, and irrational. This pattern should give us pause when considering our own contemporary approaches to mental health treatment. While modern psychiatric practice is obviously more effective and safer than drilling holes in people's heads, it's worth remembering that every previous generation of physicians was equally convinced that their methods represented the pinnacle of medical science and that previous approaches had been obviously flawed and unscientific. The story that perhaps best encapsulates the broader themes of our journey involves Dr. Heinrich Zimmermann, a late 18th century physician who had spent his entire career perfecting what he called integrated melancholic intervention protocols. Dr. Zimmermann had combined elements from every major treatment approach: cranial drilling, humeral rebalancing, environmental therapy, musical intervention, and zoological assistance into what he believed was the ultimate comprehensive treatment system. Dr. Zimmerman's method involved a 6-month residential program where patients progressed through carefully designed phases of increasingly intensive therapeutic intervention. The process began with environmental optimization and musical therapy, progressed through humeral rebalancing and cranial modification, and concluded with what he called comprehensive therapeutic integration, involving all treatment modalities simultaneously. His facility was a marvel of 18th century medical engineering, featuring elaborate chambers designed for optimal humeral circulation, therapeutic animal habitats, precision drilling equipment, and what he described as acoustic emotional optimization systems. For 20 years, Dr. Zimmerman treated hundreds of patients using his integrated approach, CONSISTENTL, while reporting remarkable success rates in his published papers. His facility attracted patients from across Europe, and his methods were taught at several prestigious medical universities. Dr. Zimmerman was widely considered one of the leading experts in melancholia treatment, and his theoretical framework was regarded as representing the most advanced understanding of depression available at the time. But in 1796, Dr. Zimmerman encountered Dr. Penal's writings about humane treatment approaches and decided to conduct what he called a scientific comparison of therapeutic methodologies. He divided his incoming patients into 2 groups, one receiving his full integrated treatment protocol, and the other receiving only basic environmental improvements, nutritious food, respectful conversation, and opportunities for meaningful activity.